We have more chairs coming in. I apologize that some of you have to wait for chairs, but we're working on getting some additional seating in here. I'm going to get started, even though some people are still getting settled. Thank you for bearing with us. My name is Carol Kowalski. I'm the Assistant Town Manager for Development, and I want to welcome you to Who Will Lexington Be? I want to thank you, and I want to acknowledge some people who are here with us. This is a part of the Comprehensive Plan update, and the Planning Board appointed a Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee, and I'd like the members, first of all, I'd like to mention the co-chairs of the Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee. Ray Yuan is here. Ray, if you could, thank you. And Sarah Felton is a co-chair of the CPAC, and we have members with us from that committee as well. Len and other members who are here, if you wouldn't mind showing people who you are, please. Hemabat, Len Morse-Fortier. Thank you. And the liaisons to the Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee for the Board of Selectmen, Joe Paddo. Thank you, Joe. And Kate Colburn for the School Committee liaison. Is Kathleen? Okay, I didn't want to overlook Kathleen if she was here. And the Planning Board liaisons, Jenna Johnson, and there she is, and Richard Canali in the back. Charles Hornig is here with us, and I hope I'm not overlooking our new Planning Board member, recently elected Tuesday, Bob Peters. I'm not sure if, I haven't seen Bob yet. Okay. Okay. And town meeting members, I know we have a number of town meeting members here and school committee members. Scott, would you mind standing or just waving? And Kate is also a school committee member, but she's the school committee liaison. And we have a lot of board and committee members here and town meeting members. Thank you very much for coming, and congratulations to recently elected officials and town meeting members. As I said, Lexington is in the middle of updating our comprehensive long-range plan. The Board of Selectmen received an update this week on the comprehensive plan update and the process to date, and that selectmen's meeting will be available for view on demand. It's about an hour into the meeting. If you want to see that update, you can go on demand and sneak through an hour of that, fast forward. So I also wanted to let you know that you can stay in contact on the website, lexingtonma.gov/compplan, COMPPLAN. That's the town website for the comp plan page. But we're soon launching a beautiful website just for the comprehensive plan. And that right now is lexingtonma.gov/compplan with a hyphen, comp-plan. Sorry about the confusion. Also, you can sign up for emails on the town website on the Stay Informed tab on the homepage. If you go to the third option, you can sign up for comprehensive plan updates. Tonight's presentation is an important part of Lexington Next, the update of Lexington's 2003 comprehensive plan. In order to plan for Lexington's future, we need to know who we are expecting. To tell us about Lexington's population trends and school enrollment projections, we are fortunate to have Dr. Marian Cohen, the director of the Center for Social Research at Framingham State University, and Dr. Maureen Kavanaugh, director of planning and assessment for Lexington Public Schools. Dr. Cohen will go first, followed by Dr. Kavanaugh, and then followed by your questions, please. We really want to hear from you. We want to hear your comments, concerns, and issues that you hear after learning about the trends. Your concerns will help shape the plan going forward. So I'd like to first introduce Dr. Marian Cohen. She is a statistician, demographer, professor, Lexington resident, and town meeting member. Dr. Cohen worked with Lexington Vision 2020 on the 2017 survey of residents and presented the survey results to many groups. Please welcome Dr. Cohen, and she will describe our general population trends. I should mention, too, that she has a BA in sociology and a Ph.D. in sociology from Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Cohen, thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight and for joining us for this very important conversation. I know that planning for a future, any kind of future, is fraught with all sorts of unknowns and possibilities and frustrations, and I am not going to be here tonight to tell you what we should do or even what we could do, but what I am going to do is present you with some information to help guide that process, or at least inform the process. So I'm going to present three categories, if you will, of information. I'm going to start with demographic trends in Lexington, and I'm going to chart them from the year 2000 up through 2017. I think as you'll see as we talk about this, there are some interesting trends that emerge from that and some interesting questions that get raised about where we've been and where we might be going. I'm then going to present some comparative data from both the 2012 and 2017 townwide surveys that asked residents about what issues were important to them in town. And as you'll see as we go through this discussion, the numbers are useful to look at, but in some ways, because predictions very often fail, it's more important to know what is it that people want. And so that's why I'm going to make those presentations. And then finally, I'm going to identify some key variables that residents have expressed their concerns about that I think should be part of the planning process. So bear with me as we go through the data, the statistics. I will try to talk about them with you. And then certainly if you have questions later, I'm happy to answer them. So in this first slide, you see some population trends in Massachusetts. And as you can see, these projections or predictions are about the overall size of the population in Massachusetts through the year 2035. Size obviously continues to grow, but percentage or the rate of growth drops. Lexington is predicted to grow at a slower rate than will other areas in the state, including many of our neighboring towns. And we can already see this reduction in the rate of growth happening. For example, between 2015 and 2016, the population in Lexington grew at a rate of 0.72%, while the population of Massachusetts grew at a rate of 0.99%. Between 2017 and 2018, Massachusetts' population grew by 0.6%, and Lexington's population actually fell by 2,333 residents. Excuse me. In 2010, Lexington was growing faster than the rest of Middlesex County. By 2017, that trend had reversed. And it's projected that by the year 2022, Lexington will grow at a considerably slower rate than will the rest of Middlesex County. Neighboring towns such as Arlington and Burlington have been among the top 25 locations in growth between 2010 and 2017, and Lexington has not been in that list at all. It's expected between now and 2030 that populations in neighboring towns such as Arlington, Bedford, and Woburn will continue to grow at much greater rates than will the population in Lexington. I want to focus now on some specific Lexington statistics. So the first is age distribution, and one of the things you'll see here is that the rate of growth in the under 5 population has been declining since the year 2000. Among those aged 5 through 19, growth has been small. I'm not going to focus on that. Maureen is definitely going to be focusing on that, and so I'm going to leave that for her to discuss. At the same time, as you can see, the percentages in the 20 to 59 age category have been growing. This was of particular concern to Lexington a number of years ago because if you broke this down even further, what you would see is that we had relatively few residents in the 20 and 30 range categories, and there was a concern about why they weren't here. One of the speculations, of course, was housing, that it was too expensive to live here. And so they weren't moving back into town. People were moving into town when they were older and they could afford to buy some of the houses. And you'll see in a later slide that I have about housing changes, how this all kind of fits together. This group is an important bubble because these are the folks who in a sense, are the future of the town, and they're also the greatest source of revenue for the town. So one of the things that I think we need to plan for, or at least consider in planning, is how to get more of these folks in this age group moving into town. Again, that's the 20 to 59 age group. There's been a decline in those aged 60 and older. It's not a huge decline, but it's a decline nonetheless. And by all accounts, that's going to continue into the future. We've already passed, in a sense, the point in history where the aging population keeps growing. And we're now about to face a period in history where the people aged 60 and older are going to start shrinking relative to people in other age groups. A number of reasons for that. One is the potential out-migration of people who realize that they can no longer physically and or financially afford to stay in their own homes, and if there is no other place in town for them to move to, they're going to move to other communities to accommodate those needs. The second thing is, and this is a prediction that sadly for people like me in the baby boomer generation, the prediction is that baby boomers will not live as long as their parents' generation has, nor will they be in as good health. So again, that's a potential reason for shrinkage in that group. Planning for those aged 60 and older is particularly difficult because it's a moving target. Ground rules change, expectations change. There was an article recently in the Boston Globe about this cohort saying that they don't identify with being old and that they don't necessarily want to be around people who they see as old, however they're defining it, or want to be part of any organization or organized activity that has the word senior in it. And I can tell you that for many, many years, I was chair of the Council on Aging, and this was when the senior center existed in the basement of Muzzy. And the population we saw there did not represent the so-called senior population in Lexington. It was mostly comprised of people who didn't have the money or other resources to get services and activities elsewhere. One of the good things that has happened in town was the creation of the community center, which draws people from all ages and for a variety of purposes. And so if you are 60 and older and you go to the senior center, everybody's not going to be looking at you and saying, oh, senior. You could be there for any number of reasons. And I think that's been a very good thing because it gets more of our seniors using the services and facilities we provide without having to worry about the kind of onus or bad name that may be associated with being a mature person. The other thing that I think we need to pay attention to with regard to age in town is the growing number of like-minded groups that are springing up that are composed of people who want to age in place. And they are setting up these cohorts and networks so that they can support one another as they age in their own homes. And I think that's something we should pay attention to. One other thing I want to point out on this slide, and that is this down here, the median age. As you can see, in the year 2000, it was 43.7. In the year 2017, it's 45. Currently in Middlesex County, the median age is 38.5. So we are older than our counterparts in the rest of the county. It's also projected that by the year 2022, the median age in Lexington will be 48.7, so it will get older. So now that I've just said that the older population is shrinking, I'm now telling you we're going to be older as a whole population, and that's for a number of reasons. Several of them include things such as adult children living at home longer, not moving out on their own, extended families becoming more common, parents of adult children living with their children, and fewer young people, and that speaks to that declining population in the 5 and under category that I had pointed out. In terms of educational attainment, you can see we have an increasingly well-educated population. We currently have, as you see on the slide, 54% of our population with graduate or professional degrees. That's very impressive, and that is likely to continue. All forecasts seem to indicate that that's going to at least stabilize, if not grow. By comparison, in Middlesex County, only 27.2% of the population has a graduate or professional degree. So again, there's that unique aspect to Lexington. Planning in this regard needs to take into account the needs and desires of this population. Some programs already exist. The OWL program, the Older, Wiser, Lifelong Learners, that's offered through the community center and the senior group, programs through the library and so on. Those kinds of things I think need to be encouraged because more and more of our population are going to be expecting those kinds of things from us. If we look at ethnicity, as you're probably already aware, this is an area which has seen the most change in recent years. It's projected, as you can see, the white population has gone from 86.1% in the year 2000 to 68.3% in the year 2017. And it's projected that by the year 2022, that number will be 63.5. So as the white population declines, obviously other populations are going to fill in the gaps. The town is already responding to these changes. There are more resources at the library. Attempts have been made to hire or at least make available people able to speak languages other than English, and that's particularly important in our safety, that is police and fire departments and human services departments. Most of the subgroups, many of them anyway, have taken it upon themselves to acculturate, assimilate, incorporate into town, but the town needs to be even more welcoming and supportive than it currently is. Linked to this change in ethnicity is a change by place of birth. And this slide speaks to migration patterns since the year 2000. Many of those born in Massachusetts have traditionally remained here, and that is now changing. Many of our current residents have moved here either from other places in the United States or from abroad. Again, that growing Asian population that we saw on the previous slide is consistent with the growth in people from abroad. In fact, the jump in the percentage of foreign-born is most striking and again relates to the information in the previous slide about the makeup of our population. One other slide related to ethnicity changes is the languages at home, spoken at home other than English. This increase in the language other than English is consistent with the growth in the percentage of Asian Americans and those who are foreign-born, and that raises issues for us in terms of planning with regard to services provided by the town and a whole host of issues that I'm sure exist in the school department, as I'm sure Maureen will speak to. The next two slides focus on income and economic issues. This is a slide on household income, and it illustrates the significant growth in income in the uppermost income category. Growth can also be seen in the mean household income figures, which are down here. So in the year 2000, the mean household income in Lexington was about $97,000. In the year 2017, the mean household income is $162,000, a little over $162,000. That puts us near the top of communities in our area. The top in our area is Dover, with a mean household income of $204,000, and communities such as Weston and Wellesley and Carlisle are also right up there. The mean household income for comparison, however, with Middlesex County is about $93,000, just under $93,000. So again, this is a wealthier community than many of our neighboring communities. Generally, sociologically speaking, and I'm comfortable speaking sociologically because that's what I do, the higher the income in a community, the more demand is placed on specialized services and the greater the expectations of the residents that those services will be provided. This can include everything from more in-town activities for children to enhanced library services, to intellectually challenging and stimulating programs, which is again consistent with the higher education level that we saw in a previous slide. This slide demonstrates what's happened with home values, and as you can see, there's been almost a doubling in price of home values, especially in the highest price point. As the median listing price indicates, in the period since 2000, the price has increased almost 4.5 times. So again, I don't know if you can see it down there along the bottom, but the median listing price in 2000 was about $450,000. The median listing price in 2019, so these are figures that just came out, is $2.199 million. So it's jumped dramatically. Further, what's important to note is that the median sales price in 2018 was $1.15 million. The average sales price was $1.255 million. So we're talking about expensive homes. It's predicted that as more millennials enter the market, there will be greater demand for homes, including those in the upper price ranges. But, and this is an important caveat, that could change with an economic downturn. And since even the best of economists cannot accurately predict what's going to happen to the economy, that makes it very hard to know what's going to happen to housing prices. While the percentage of home values in the 300 to 999,999 categories have been declining, they still represent a sizable percentage of housing stock. By comparison, in Middlesex County, 72.6% of housing stock is in that price range. In Lexington, it's 65.1%, and only 7.6% of housing stock in Middlesex County is in the $1 million range or over, and in Lexington, it's 30.6%. So again, this is a more expensive, wealthier community. As we know, the more people have invested in their homes, the more they're inclined to seek to protect that investment. And that could well translate into the kinds of comments that we're already hearing about people's needs to protect their neighborhood and to limit growth, especially certain kinds of growth in those neighborhoods. This travel time to work slide is associated with quality of living issues, and it's very clear that time to travel to work has significantly increased since 2009. More people are spending at least 45 minutes commuting either to or from work, or in each direction. Additionally, the mean time for travel has increased to over 30 minutes. And again, that's down here. In the year 2000, it took about 27 minutes, and in 2017, it took almost 32 minutes. One priority might be to increase opportunities for people to work in town, and I know this is brazen of me, but I'm going to do it anyway. As one recent candidate for selectman pointed out, there are many people in town who work in the biotech and tech fields. More commercial developments that include lab space would enable more of such people to work locally. That would be good on a number of levels. It's good for the environment because you have fewer people on the roads polluting the environment. It's good in terms of time commitments. People spend less time in travel, more time either working or at home or pursuing other things. And it's also good for mental health. Research consistently demonstrates that commuting takes a toll on people's sense of well-being and their overall mental health. And I just want to say, and this is a related but not to this slide issue, the issue of mental health is an important one to include in all of our planning efforts. We know that more than 1 in 5 people is affected by a psychiatric disorder at any given point in time. In this room, I can guarantee you right now, there are quite a number of people who are either personally suffering from a psychiatric disorder, have a relative who is, or a friend who is, or who are in treatment for such a disorder. In Lexington, mostly we've been focused on mental health issues in connection with our students at the high school, but I can tell you that mental health issues affect everyone, from the very, very young to the very old. Mental disorders have been recognized by the World Health Organization worldwide as among the top disorders affecting daily living. So if we want to make it comfortable for people, if we want to make it possible for people to live and to thrive, we need to pay attention to their mental health. And we should expect to expand our beginning efforts to provide for those with psychiatric disorders in our community. That's my personal pitch. I happen to be a specialist in the sociology of mental health. Methods of transportation are related to time travel. Fewer people, as you can see, are using private vehicles or traveling alone than was true in 2000 or 2010, but those people still constitute the majority of commuters. There has been a small increase in the use of public transportation, which suggests that perhaps with better transportation system and more public transport options, even fewer people would opt for private transportation. And again, that would be a good thing from the standpoint of the environment, the time use, and mental health. It's also worth noting that the percentage of people working at home, which is over here, has increased steadily since the year 2000. And that argues that more information should probably be obtained from such people and about them and the work that they do. It's possible that programs and opportunities could be included in the comprehensive plan to further enable such work. So let me summarize first what I've been saying so far. Our population, like populations around the state, the country, and the world, is aging. However, it's not aging as fast as had previously been predicted. And the percentage of the population in the so-called working bubble, those 20 to 59-year-olds, is growing. A comprehensive plan should focus on that working bubble in order to attract more people to live here, to thrive here, to contribute here, and also to help support the services that we want to offer in Lexington. We already have one of the best educated populations in the state and country, and according to trends of the last 17 years, we're becoming even more educated. Programs and services that take into account the needs of a better educated population are in order. As you could see in the charts focusing on ethnicity, place of birth, and language other than English spoken at home, our cultural and ethnic diversity is growing, and that argues for more recognition of the diversity, more support for growing involvement of these diverse groups, greater encouragement of participation from these groups in town governance, and more programming and services, including translation services for such residents. We are a wealthy community growing more wealthy. Both incomes and home values are rising. If we want to be a town that welcomes more diverse income groups, we need to protect the lower-priced homes and provide more affordable housing. And those two actions, in addition to bringing new people into town or keeping people into town, would also enable the people who work in our school system and our fire departments and our police departments to live where they work, which would again be a good thing. Costs associated with travel to and from work are growing, again, environmental pollution, time investment, and mental health. Development of more laboratory space and commercial development would address both commute times and methods of transportation. So there is a need for more and better public transportation options. I'm now going to turn to a comparison of results from the 2012 and the 2017 surveys. And as you'll see, there's been relatively little change during that 5-year period. Whatever differences you see on these slides, I have to tell you, is not statistically significant. So it looks like there's a change, but it's actually very, very small. So we asked people about specifics within certain categories. One of the categories was economic development issues. From a planning perspective, 4 things stood out. One was attracting additional businesses. People said they wanted more businesses in town and more varied businesses in town. They didn't want all of the nail salons and the real estate agencies and banks. Thank you. I was trying to remember what the last one was. I knew somebody would come up with that. Exactly. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be welcoming to such enterprises. Of course we should be, but not at the expense of variety in other types of shopping. We want people to come here to do more than bank, get their nails done or their hair done, or buy houses. The second thing was creating a more vibrant downtown. People wanted to make shopping in the center more appealing to both residents and visitors, and again, more variety of businesses. Capitalizing on the town's history, people wanted us to call greater attention to the town's history. We should be proud of the fact that it all started here, and yet people are always saying things such as, how come Concord, that dreaded Concord, does such a good job? Why can't we do that kind of job? So more attention to that is something people want to see. They want to attract more visitors. They want to encourage more tourism and the attendant economic benefits of that. And in that connection, our decision to redo the visitor center is an important step in that direction. The other place we should probably put more effort is on the tourism committee, providing them with more support, more funding, and more initiative possibilities. The final was creating a supportive regulatory framework, and that meant making regulations more transparent and making information about them more readily available. So there's a clear desire for accountability mechanisms with regard to the economic development. Secondly, we asked about environmental issues, and people said that protection of land is important, and that came up both in terms of agricultural and farmlands and in terms of open space, the environment in the open space, and also protecting against too much development in the open spaces. People also wanted to see energy consumption reduced, specifically by the town. So they said they wanted conservation to occur on the part of the town, but they were concerned that the economic costs associated with such reductions be carefully reviewed so they don't exceed, to quote the respondents, reasonable limits. I don't know what that means, but obviously people who responded to this have some sense of what that means. People were willing to reduce their own energy consumption, but they weren't necessarily willing to spend a lot of money or time or effort to achieve that. I know that we have banned plastic bags in town, and I hear from my constituents in my precinct all the time about what a bad decision that was, because it's a pain. They have to bring bags with them to the supermarket. The bags get dirty. They have to wash the bags. They forget the bags. The paper bags that Stop and Shop provides don't have handles. They break on the way home. And more of my neighbors are now telling me that they no longer shop at Stop and Shop. They go to Waltham because they have plastic bags. So we're not necessarily getting rid of plastic bags in Lexington. We're just not providing them in Lexington. I know that there's a warrant article that's coming up at the upcoming town meeting about banning straws. Banning straws is not necessarily a good idea if you have any kind of disability. And to say that, well, instead of plastic straws, you can use paper straws don't bend the way plastic straws do. So I guess what I'm saying is my recommendation is that we not neglect these environmental impacts. We should be careful about them, we should be conscious of them, but we should also be conscious about the effect that they have on various groups of people in town before we just say no more of these. Physical character issues focused primarily on preserving what makes Lexington, Lexington. So preserve and enhance our historic structures and also focus on the physical character of our neighborhoods. At the same time, residents wanted attention paid to making everyday life easier and better. And that included things like enhancing the town center, improving the flow of traffic, providing adequate parking, and making historic structures accessible. It's lovely to have historic structures, but if people can't get in them and appreciate them, they might as well not exist. Population diversity issues speak to mostly honoring our diversity in terms of several issues. Being welcoming to diverse groups in town and providing diversity in housing for those in different income and age groups and ability groups. Town government issues focused on fiscal responsibility, including balancing short-term needs and long-term goals, which is obviously a primary purpose of planning, living within Proposition 2.5, being careful about spending money and how it's spent, and all of this will require, as respondents noted, a prioritization of needs. So now I'm going to talk about the prioritization of needs. In the 2017 survey, we asked respondents to tell us in their own words what specifically mattered to them, and those fell into a number of categories. And we gathered this information both from open-ended questions on the survey and also through focus groups that we conducted. So first was housing, and these issues here focused primarily on diversity of housing, and affordability of housing. As you can see, people did not like the teardowns that are happening, the mansionization that's happening. People thought there was too much overdevelopment or crowding in town, that we were losing the small, moderately priced homes to large and more expensive ones, that the socioeconomic diversity was therefore being lost or certainly diminished, and that we were ending up with houses that were too large on lots that were too small. In terms of the environment, people focused primarily on preserving land and trees. They wanted a more reliable and effective power grid. They're really kind of fed up with all the outages that we have. I know that we installed a generator at my house because I got tired of sleeping in the cold and eating cold food and throwing food out. And a lot of my neighbors have done the same thing. We shouldn't have to install generators. We should be able to provide for our population. They wanted a reduction in noise and environmental pollution, and specifically they complained about the Hanscom area issue, the idling of buses and trucks and so on, and they wanted controlled residential development. In terms of the town center, they focused primarily on issues of how the center looked, and the Center Streetscape project should address that. But again, we have to be careful with what we do with that. As I'm sure you know, there's been a lot of debate in recent years about the material used for sidewalks, the color of sidewalks, the cutouts, the traffic flow, and so on. From what I'm hearing from my neighbors and people in my precinct, we're not there yet. And before we just start instituting the streetscape plan, I think we have some more thinking to do about that. They also wanted to increase the vitality of the center, again, the increased variety in businesses, and they wanted to address issues about the use in the center, including a reduction in traffic lights and a better traffic flow. In terms of traffic, they focused primarily on improving road conditions. They didn't like all the potholes that we have, for example. They wanted to reduce the amount of traffic, and related to that, they wanted more transportation options. In terms of schools, they were concerned about three things primarily. One was overcrowding, another was class size, and the last was ensuring that the needs of all students are met. I'm sure you've all heard the same thing that I heard when I moved here before I had kids, that I heard when my kids were in school, and that I'm still having, which is that if you have really gifted, really bright kids, they get a lot from the schools, and if you have kids who are disabled or have limitations, they get a lot from the schools. But if you have a child who resides in that very large middle group, that your child is not getting the same kind of attention. Maureen and I were talking about this just before. I don't exactly know what that means or how to measure it, but that's the story that goes around. So that's what I think people mean about meeting all the needs. In terms of financial issues and taxes, people focused on affordability, increasing the commercial tax base to lower the tax burden on residents, reducing the number and frequencies of overrides, debt exclusions, and so on, and helping make living and remaining in Lexington more possible. Regarding budgets, they wanted to make sure that there was no conflict between the school and municipal budgets. Schools are highly valued in this town, and people are not ready to give up on the schools in favor of the municipal side, but they also don't want schools receiving too much and the municipal side too little. They also wanted to make sure that there was adequate funding, as I just indicated, for the schools, but also for the police and fire departments. So finally, a list of priorities that people identified. And I'm just going to put these up here and then talk about one final one that I haven't addressed. Most of these you'll see I've already addressed. So we have preserving schools, increasing commercial density, affordability, diversity, preservation of open space. And by the way, when we asked people which they preferred, preserving open space, affordable housing, or more recreation, they chose preserving open space over affordable housing and preserving, increased recreation space. Regulation of residential land use, the infrastructure, again, that's the power grid and the roads, and then planning for the future, which is, of course, what this is all about, so that's perfect. And one final one, which was transparency. That was a theme that was woven throughout survey results, even though it didn't come up as a specific item. It just kept coming up over and over and over again. In terms of projects for the town, specific questions that were asked included, what is the source of the funds for the project? Why are we using consultants? Could the work not be done in-house? And in fact, the enrollment working group for the Lexington Public Schools noted that they found it better to use local and town talent rather than rely on consultants. So we already have precedent for that. They wanted to know about the costs for consultants if they're used and if in fact it's cost effective. What is the bidding process? How are consultants and contractors selected? What criteria are used? And when consultants or contractors are hired, who makes those decisions? The concern primarily was, how do we avoid conflicts of interest? As I'm sure you know, we have a town full of people with lots of connections to all sorts of things, and people wanted to make sure that those connections weren't the ones who got the project bids, as opposed to maybe a better organization that didn't happen to have connections. They also wanted to know about the real costs for projects, including initial outlays for resources and equipment, the lifespan of the resources and equipment, and replacement costs for the resources and equipment. So I'm going to end with some brief final comments and then turn it over to Maureen, who's been sitting there very patiently. Thank you. There are lots of variables, including unknowns, to consider when planning, and that's what makes it so difficult. As is widely acknowledged, including again by the Enrollment Working Group in their December 2014 report on forecasts for the Lexington Public Schools, the task of predicting is complex, and there are many variables that are not predictable, including, as they noted, and I quote, consideration of changes in the national and local economies that would have an impact. It's important to look at the trends and the numbers, as I did at the beginning of this presentation, but even those have not shown to be, those predictions based on those have not shown to be particularly good predictors of the future. There are too many variables to identify, some of which we don't even know exist, and there are too many unknowns with regard to the variables that we can identify and have identified. Perhaps what's more useful is to look at what people tell us is important to them, which is why I included the second two-thirds of this report. There are few real changes, as I said, in what is deemed to be important in the 5-year period between 2012 and 2017. So what's been identified as important is valuable to consider because of the consistency. And the same is true of the concerns that were expressed by residents, and also the identified priorities should provide guidance on where to focus our efforts. Thank you. I'm going to get yours.
Go right ahead.
Just want to let everyone know that this is viewable in the Hudson Room upstairs. We have a simulcast, so for anyone who's sitting in an aisle that might not want to be sitting there or standing, please feel free to go upstairs to the Hudson Room. Thank you very much. Dr. Maureen Kavanaugh has a BA in psychology, and her Ph.D. is from the Lynch School of Education at Boston College in educational research, measurement, and evaluation. Dr. Kavanaugh will now describe Lexington's school enrollment trends.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here. I am Director of Planning and Assessment for the Lexington Public Schools. That was an extremely comprehensive presentation. I'm very, very glad I only have to tell you about the public schools. So perhaps I'll be a little briefer, shorter, and very focused on the schools and specifically our school population. That being said, I think what you'll see is a lot of what we find in our school data mirrors that of what we see on a town level and some of the data that Dr. Cohen has already presented. The other caveat I'll say, I'll hedge my bets right up front, is I will do the best to answer all your questions, and hopefully I've made good choices about what to present to you up front. I anticipate that I won't be able to answer all your questions, but at the end of my presentation of the data that we have, I will mention some of the other planning activities that are going on within the school department in conjunction with some of the town comprehensive activities. And if you're following some of these things like the Lexington Public Schools master planning process and the redistricting, there is lots of analysis that will be going on throughout the spring that is related to the types of questions and conversations that come up in rooms like this. So just to be sure that everybody, I didn't want to assume that everybody has thorough knowledge of the schools in town. The Lexington Public Schools is made up of 10 schools. That includes 1 preschool, 6 elementary schools serving grades K through 5, 2 middle schools serving grades 6 through 8, and 1 high school serving grades 9 through 12. We also participate in the Metropolitan Council for Educational Opportunity Program, or METCO. This program is intended to expand educational opportunities, increase diversity, and reduce racial isolation by permitting students, Boston students, to attend public schools in other communities in the region, including ours. It provides both the sending and the receiving districts opportunities and support for cross-cultural understanding and appreciation. We also have a number of district-wide special education programs that service and support low-incident disability areas by offering more intensive supports. And each of our schools houses at least one of these programs. These programs allow us to service students who have more intense special needs, who might traditionally in other districts attend more costly, more expensive, and certainly less inclusive out-of-district placements. So starting at sort of a high level and something very basic, shown here is a trend of our overall PK12 enrollment. This depicts enrollment since 1981. You can see there has been a fairly steady increasing trend since around the early 90s. Over the past 5 years, so more recently, enrollment has increased by 615 students, or rate of 9.3%. On average, that has meant an increase of 123 students per year. Not shown, but something to keep in mind, there was a peak in enrollment at just over 9,600 students in 1969. This was when Lexington had 11 elementary schools, 3 middle schools, and 1 high school. After that peak, enrollment dropped steeply over the next 2 decades, and you're seeing sort of the tail end of that right about here. Just to break it down a little bit at a more detailed level, what we're showing here is enrollment trends by grade level. The green line is our elementary, our orange line is our high school, and our blue line is that is our middle school. So we have, in sort of this sort of nearish term, I would say 6-7 years ago, we had previously been experiencing a lot of growth and pressure at the elementary level. A little bit more recently, say the last 2 to 3 years, much of that pressure or that feeling of pressure has moved up to the secondary level. So that high growth that was happening in our elementary grades, those students are now progressing up through our systems and now putting pressure on our middle and our elementary schools. To put some numbers to it, in the past 5 years, K through 5, we've increased by 170 students, and that's a rate of increase of 5.9%. At the middle school, we had an increase of 177 students during that same time period, which was a 10.7% increase. At the high school level, we've experienced an increase of 261 students over the last 5 years, or a 13% increase. And here is the intention is to just provide you a snapshot of where our schools are at today. These provide our enrollments by grade as of October 1 for each school and by grade. Our largest elementary schools by enrollment are Bridge, Bowman, and Estabrook, and I'm going to show you a map on the next slide just to orient you on physically where those are located in town. Currently, enrollment at our middle schools are roughly even between Clark and Diamond. Clark had previously been the larger school, and through many different strategies, we've been trying to even out that enrollment and make use of our expanded space at the Diamond Middle School. The grade totals can be found at the bottom row. We have 4 rather large cohorts moving through our system right now at grades 5, 6, 8, and 9 that we have our eye on. One of those have entered our high school as 9th graders, and the second will enter next year. which is definitely on our minds in terms of putting more pressure on an already crowded facility. To give you a sense of where things are physically located, this is a map of town with our schools highlighted. We have our high school located in the very center of town. Diamond Middle School can be found on the north side and Clark in the south. Two of our large elementary schools, Bridge and Bowman, are located in the south, while we have our Estabrook School in the north. What's significant about this, one of the other projects we have going on right now is an elementary redistricting. This ties in with our building projects that we've been engaged in for the past few years. Some of what is not readily apparent on some of these maps is just the density of population and where it's specifically located. For this, we don't have the analysis completely done. I would, if you're interested in such things, I would encourage you to follow our redistricting efforts, where we'll take apart all that and we'll have all sorts of wonderful maps and things ready in the coming months. But the summary of it is much of our population, this is the part of town where our schools experience consistently the most pressure, whereas as we're expanding space on this side of town, there's actually less student population up there. So one of our challenges is trying to move the population through redistricting, through our lines, to where our facilities are. When we consider the composition of our student population, one of the ways that we can look at is by race. And this is definitely an area where we will see mirroring trends that we see at our student population, similar to what Dr. Cohen just showed us. 45.9% of our students are considered white. The next largest group would be our Asian population at 39.3%, with smaller proportions for African American, multiracial, and Hispanic. When we consider racial and ethnic composition over time, so that's what is shown here, each color represents one of those racial groups. You can see over time our student population is becoming more diverse. So this blue area here represents the proportion of students who are identifying as white. You can see this area is much bigger, and as we progress through time, this becomes smaller in proportion. At the same time, our Asian population has been growing. It may be a little bit hard to see, but the other groups that have been growing in our multi-race group, although still a very small proportion of our population, has been expanding. We've also seen some slight growth in our Hispanic population. We've seen small declines in our proportion of students who are identifying as African American. Again, very similar to what we saw at the town level. Some other characteristic we monitor are the number of students whose first language is something other than English. We also take a look at who are English language learners, our students with disabilities, and our students who are considered economically disadvantaged. Compared to state rates shown in orange here, we have a much lower proportion of students who are economically disadvantaged, a smaller percent of students with disabilities, slightly smaller numbers of English language learners, and a much greater number of students who are reporting a first language other than English. Just under a third of our students, or 30.8%. An important note, just to be clear, is that many of the students who are reporting a first language other than English are perfectly proficient in English. These are different from our English language learners. These students are often multilingual and just are listing their first language or their native language as something other than English. A few more details on that is that in 2019, there were 61 primary first languages reported for our students other than English, representing quite the diversity of our population. The top languages other than English were Chinese at 11%, Korean at 2.2%, Spanish at 1.7%, Russian at 1.5%, and then some additional languages in smaller proportions were Hindi, Japanese, and French. So taking apart that number a little bit more over time, this is a graph of how the percent of students whose first language is not English, and how that has changed over time. That proportion is represented in the dark blue, and very clearly you can see that population has been very steadily increasing over time. If you compare the rates in 1994 of 7.1%, with the rates today at 30.8%, it's grown quite a bit. Our English language learners, this is another group where we've seen steady increases over time. Today we are at our percent of 8.8%. One of the reasons we look at this is this has impacts on the type of supports and how we need to staff our schools. So not only has the proportion of English language learners increased, but we must keep in mind that our overall population has increased. So in this second row here, we have the total count of students. In 1994, we had 75 students who fell into this category in our system, versus today where we have 636 students that we're supporting. So a little similar but different is our special education population. The deal here is that the percent of students who are receiving special education services has actually declined over time. So we've gone from a percent of 19.2 in 1994 to a rate of 14.1 today as of October 1. And so one of the interesting things here is although we've had this pretty dramatic overall population increase, because that proportion's been going down, you can see our number of special education students has remained remarkably steady over that period of time, with some increases in the middle there. The last characteristic is the percent economically disadvantaged. The reason for this shorter viewpoint is the state changed the metric of how they calculate this, and it's no longer comparable to their previous definition of low income. But the takeaway here is that over this relatively short period, the rates, the percent of students falling in this category has remained relatively consistent, which struck me as on one of Dr. Cohen's slide that considered income. Although the upper ends of that, the income stream were increasing, the lower end seems to be remaining pretty constant. So the tricky part of this presentation, and I'm glad Dr. Cohen said everything that she said about how to predict the future. We've talked a lot about what enrollment has been and what it looks like today. The historic trends can sometimes help us estimate what the future might look like, but there are so many caveats and notes that I'll lead with. So to do this, we typically use two methods. One relies on historic data, that enrollment data that considers in and out migration patterns, and uses this to predict the future. The other model that we typically use comes out of the enrollment working group work, and that method is based on housing data. And so that considers the housing stock, the percent of housing units that have children in them, an indicator of family size, so every home that has a child in them, how many children are in that home, and then to account for our non-residential students, which is our METCO students, we add a constant. So it's important to note that these methods rest on the assumption that the future will follow the same patterns as the past. So you can see in some of these graphs there are very, very clearly some trends here. An important caveat is if some global indicator changes and the pattern changes, the projections won't hold. And that is a general caution regardless of method, that predicting the future is very difficult. These are our best predictions based on the information that we have available to us today. The other thing is the uncertainty of the task grows as the farther you attempt to go out. So we feel more confident in our 1-year projection than we do in our 5-year projection than we do in our 10-year projections. So definitely take the 10-year projections with a grain of salt. Please. So I've mentioned something very quickly, and that is a progression rate. This is a way to kind of quickly describe the net impact of in and out migration. What you're looking at here is a bar graph that represents the 5-year average progression rates from each grade. And the takeaway here is a value greater than 1 indicates an increase in cohort size. That means the net impact of in and out migration, the cohort increased as we moved up the grade span. If the value was less than 1, it means the net impact was a decrease in cohort. as students progressed from grades 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, the cohort would have been increasing. You can see that is generally not the case. So we have a lot of green bars. That means the takeaway here is that as our students are progressing through the system, we are adding more students onto our cohorts. A lot of we have very few places where we're having net out-migration from our school system. Where we do, we see some net out-migration at our 8th to 9th grade transition and some net out-migration at our 10th and 11th grade transition. So the projections themselves. Our solid line is our actuals data, and then when we hit our these dashed lines, this represents the projection. The reason there's 3 lines there is the one in the middle, this dark gray, black, that is our midline projections. This is typically the number we plug into planning scenarios, but it's important to acknowledge the uncertainty that lives around these statistics, and that's what these top and bottom lines are. These are our upper and lower 90th confidence intervals. It is possible in the future that our values would fall there. In general, and what we're looking at is at the high school level, we are expecting pretty steady increases for a number of more years before we might level off or perhaps drop. It's hard to say what will happen after that. At the middle school level, we are predicting a far less steep incline here, but increases in the immediate years nevertheless, followed by a tailing off of growth. I will show you for the elementary both the projections generated by the cohort survival and those generated by the housing model. One, to just demonstrate the sort of trickiness and the uncertainty in the art of projecting things, but to also demonstrate that the exercise we're generally doing with our data is we look at things multiple ways to try to find some form of triangulation, acknowledging that the truth lives somewhere in the middle. So according to the cohort survival method or approach to projecting, our elementary enrollment is projected to basically level off for the next 10 years. We're not expecting any more increases or any steep declines according to this model. Our housing model is not totally different, but is suggesting that we will have continued growth, but at a far less steep rate than we've experienced in recent years, seen on this side of the graph. When you overlay the two, you can see there is some disagreement in the two, but really not much. So what tends to happen with with these elementary enrollment projections is our cohort survival method tends to underestimate, and our housing model has overestimated. So what we're planning on is that our elementary projection probably lies somewhere in the middle right here. So as I said at the beginning, the public schools is engaged in another number of planning activities in parallel to the comprehensive process that the town's engaged in, which will most certainly generate lots more analysis and lots more information. If you are information hungry and want to keep up on these things, I certainly encourage you to follow these, and where we will be posting updates. We frequently post the reports and the minutes and the analysis that are coming from these processes here, and that these are always available to you. We also have an open door policy within our offices, and should you have any questions at any time, you feel free to email. And that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Kavanaugh. Thank you, Dr. Cohen. So now we want to hear from you. I have a few questions that I'm interested. If you're all shy, I can ask you questions, but I don't really expect that. So I have a mic, and I'll just walk around and ask, and then you'll go and use the mic where you were.
So this first point isn't really a question, but am I not correct that 10 years ago, when the town was making projections like you were just discussing, the town thought they were going to be able to retire Hastings, and now I just need a yes or a no to that. It's not really a commentary. But my my other question is, my real question has to do with, so there was a plan to do a big development out on Hartwell Ave. And so my question is not about that per se, but part of that, one component of that is residential housing. And I believe that a while back when they did the Avalon development on Waltham Street, that those developers made similar projections to what the consultants were making about Hartwell Ave. And it turned out that, in fact, instead of getting, younger people and retirees at Avalon, it actually became an entry point for people who wanted to get their kids into the school system, which is a fine thing. But I guess my understanding is the town wasn't really prepared for that, and that was right on the edge of the Bowman district. So my question is, do you think that the projections being made by the consultants, which are, it's going to be residential housing on Hartwell Ave would be mostly retirees, 55 plus, and then younger people without kids, and they specifically say under 10% of units would have children going into the school system. Based on everything we saw tonight, do you think that's a credible assessment, or does the town need to be more prepared that any time new housing stock comes on the market, that it's going to have a big impact on the school system?
So, what I can say is that I'm not familiar with those specific projections from the school department. I would say our mindset is, our responsibility is to receive the students when we get them. What I can say is what knowledge that I do have about the previous estimates, specifically as they pertain to the Avalon, was that certainly my understanding is that those were grossly underestimated. I would say the thing that's different now is we do have data available in town from the school system, and certainly by combining the data across the town and the school department, we can make more informed decisions about those. But I mean, with any projection failure, you mentioned the one in the beginning about our own enrollment projections. As Dr. Cohen said, this is tricky business, and more often than not, there is error in the projection. So the general advice about being cautious about any projection is certainly something I could endorse.
Other questions?
Hi, actually, I'm just a little bit curious about do we have a statistics about what kind of people moving, especially with kids, and how they seem related to with the current housing and say price or something? Yeah, I was thinking current data, what I see is a little bit static. If we're adding a little bit dynamics into it, see what kind of people are moving, what kind of people will move out, I think a prediction might be a little bit better.
I can try to answer that a little bit. We only to say that we'll be presenting additional information on housing very soon. March 21st, we'll have a similar presentation on housing, so that will provide a little more on the difference in housing trends, tear downs, affordable housing, and price, tenure, that kind of thing. But that won't necessarily correlate with school enrollments.
I mean, just to sum up some of the broader points across what we saw in our data, we're certainly seeing our populations become more diverse. You can see that Asian population growing, and even some of the other racial groups, while the white population is decreasing, leading to a nice set of diversity that we see in our school systems. There's also quite a bit of international flavor to that. We didn't include it here, but we have similar data about country of origin and sort of birthplace, and we see very similar things to what Dr. Cohen presented in terms of increasing amounts of foreign-born children coming in with the system where their first language is not English. So a growing international flavor to our schools. That has been occurring for quite some time.
Next question.
Thank you. As a member of the over 60 cohort, I was curious as to why that wasn't listed in the itemization of priorities, unless that was included in the diversity bullet point. I have a follow-up, but I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, so it was most of the time when we hear comments about the over 60 population, it's talking about housing issues and affordability of staying in town. It comes through in the issues of taxes and stability of taxes or instability of taxes, and that's why it wasn't mentioned separately.
Another issue is transportation. One part of that is also known as the first mile, last mile issue. There are members of my cohort who find that they can't drive any longer, either voluntarily or and wish to stop driving, or involuntarily. And Lex Express does what it can, but it certainly doesn't help when you get off with a bag, 2 bags full of groceries. And I think that's an issue of concern to my cohort. Another aspect of transportation that impacts us is our ability to shop in town, and that would mean finding parking places in town. For reasons that we're not able to fathom, Lexington does not have what a number of neighboring towns like Waltham, Newton, and Medford have, and that is a sticker that allows a senior to park in an off-street lot for a nominal annual charge, and that's kind of something we'd like to see as well. Some of my cohort, including myself, belong to Lexington at Home, which those of you who don't know is a voluntary association of residents in this town who love it and want to age in place, and we celebrated our 10th anniversary last year. We have about 160 members, and we divided it up into about 5 chapters to keep the numbers manageable. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I want to point out that Lexington, Melissa Interest, would you mind standing? And Susan, would you mind standing? Because I want to point out that Lexington is also undertaking Livable Lexington, and Melissa is spearheading that with her department. It's age-friendly planning process for Lexington, and these are the kind of recommendations that I think might be considered through that eventually. It's like this process, it's a process, so they're not going to start with recommendations, but the first event is March 12th. At what time? 12:30, thank you. And Susan Barrett is the transportation coordinator, and she's just, over the 2018, did quite a very interesting transportation study for Lexington on what we call microtransit. It's not MBTA buses or commuter rail. It's not a microtransit. Do you want to be a little more specific? You're shaking your head.
Well, no, I just want to make sure people know it's not about microtransit. It's about transportation in general for our community in Burlington. Yeah. So, and you're having a panel on transportation.
Yes, April 4th is Susan will be speaking about the transportation study that I focus a little bit on the microtransit, but I also want to point out that this gentleman is correct that there is an expectation from one source I saw that will be about 30% older adult, and I forget when is that expected? I don't want to put you on the spot. 2030, okay. So that's something very important for the comprehensive plan to consider. So thank you, I like those points.
I noticed when Dr. Cohen was talking, one of the statistics she put up there, or one of the thoughts that she put up there, was that the residents in the survey were more concerned about preserving open spaces, even at the expense of affordable housing. And it occurs to me then that the only people that are going to be able to enjoy the open spaces are going to be the people who have a lot of money.
Thank you. Next question. While you're being shy, I have a question. In the meantime, I want you to consider if you thought there were data points missing or data sources missing, and see me afterwards.
Yeah, during the first presentation, there was a mention of better transportation options that people are looking for. Is Lexington going it alone in making these plans, or is there are there plans that will integrate not just with Burlington, but with Waltham and some of the other towns that are abutters to Lexington, as well as the next nearest neighbors?
Susan, would you mind trying to answer that? I know that.
So if you heard of the Tri-Town Transit Study, that was in partnership with Bedford, Burlington, and Lexington. That came about for a variety of reasons. One being, the town managers of those communities have been talking for years about their various transportation needs and the different local services they had, and might there be a better way to operate those. But also that partnership came about because there was a regional transportation study that was done, and one of the recommendations that came out of that was that to improve regional transportation, if it was for the Middlesex 3 area, if those our three towns came together, we might be able to find some better solutions to enhance regional transportation. That said, we also know that Waltham and Woburn and Arlington are also key places, and of course a majority of our folks are trying to commute into Cambridge and Boston. So we are doing more work on this. It's because there are so many various needs, so there's still work to be done, and we have not forgotten those other people and the other places that people want to get to. And there'll be more on that at the panel on April. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Cohen mentioned that there's always a possibility of some economic downturn. Given that that could occur, have we done any studies on, well, I know it's a census question, but do we have an idea of how many children in Lexington are going to private schools with the anticipation that some of them may not be able to afford to go to private schools if, in fact, there's an economic downturn?
We've had a very consistent rate of children attending something other than a public school for quite some time at about 10%. And it's been very consistent.
Next hand.
One thing that's bothered me is that the houses have gotten larger and the lots smaller. In other words, houses are put on a lot now, and there's very much of a garden or whatever you want to call it around it. It doesn't look good to me. Used to be, if you went around in Lexington, you saw very nice yards around the house. No, there's very little around all the ones that are going up.
And that is going to be part of the focus of the housing presentation on March 21st. There'll be 3 aspects to that presentation, and one of them will be on concern over very large houses on lots that may seem overwhelmed by the large houses. It's not the only focus of that housing presentation, but it is something that's on the minds of a lot of members of the Comprehensive Plan Advisory Committee and how to address it. There's also, many of you may be aware that the Board of Selectmen formed an ad hoc special permit residential development committee, and they've been hard at work trying to look at the part of the town bylaw that's presented as an alternative to conventional subdivisions, and that was a result of a warrant article that was considered at town meeting last year. So there is some work going on that subject.
Sort of makes us look like instead of being a town, we're beginning to look like a city.
Next question. I don't want to neglect anyone. Don't be shy. We still have time.
I was wondering if you try to take into account overall sociological trends. So when I moved here in the 60s, many people worked at the same place for their entire working life, and a lot of us who moved here then are getting old and leaving. But now more people seem to be leaving after their kids are finished with school or leaving because their jobs have moved someplace else. So do you try to take into account the type of turnover and how quickly things turn over and why they turn over?
I should let one of the experts answer this, but generally speaking, a lot of our inner metro communities are seeing a lot more turnover. I believe Lexington is, I'm going to get this off a little bit, but not, the principle is there's a majority of residents moved here in the last 6 years. Now, majority could be, I really want to put a fine point on that, and we will present that through the comprehensive plan information on the website, but that's not unusual in the metro communities, that the majority of the residents didn't live here 6 years ago. So that's an interesting point. I think that's a little counterintuitive, at least it was for me when I learned it. Do you want to try to address that?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to that because I think what you're reporting is what we hear a lot. I'm not sure that the data necessarily support that. A lot of the people, for example, in my cohort whose kids have gone through the school system, graduated and moved on, are still here. So the idea that as our children age out of the school system, we move out of town may be less true than the rumor or the general consensus seems to be. I don't have specific numbers on that, and I would be interested to see those as well. But I think as Carol pointed out, there's a generalized pattern across the country that people move more than they used to. In my parents' generation, you grew up in one place and you died in that place. And that was certainly not true with my generation. We went off to college and we never came home again. We went to someplace else. And then many of us have moved multiple times throughout our lives. So it's a complex question. It isn't just an issue of do people move in and then do they move out? It's a lot more than that, which makes it hard to answer that. I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Similarly, I can't give you specific numbers, but I can talk generally about some of the things we learned when we, over the past few years of trying to enhance our enrollment projection methods, and some of the variables we experimented with, which seem to have a relationship with an increase or decrease in overall student population. And there were two things that we learned, one very early on and one a little bit later. One had to do with using Lexington births as a predictor for kindergarten. So traditional projection methods use this. If you know how many births have happened in town, the assumption is that you can then use that data to predict what your kindergarten cohort's going to look like. It doesn't hold up here. And that, what is suggestive in that fact is that there is quite a bit of in-migration that happens between, with families who have children between the ages of 0 and 5. So many of the kindergartners who arrive in town weren't here when they were born 5 years ago. On the other end of it, I guess our question was, well, if we know you're a graduate or you just graduated, and we know if we somehow can determine that your family has graduated all your children, can we predict that you're going to move out for sure and therefore somehow factor this into that's an open spot where maybe another family could come in? When we looked at it, when Joe Pato looked at it, we found that the drop-off isn't quite as dramatic as kind of the narrative that sits in some people's heads, that it was a much more gradual pattern to it, that there, when children graduate from the K-12 school system, some families leave, a bunch of families stay and then leave some years later. A bunch of families never leave, and they stay all throughout. So.
I was surprised to see that the survey didn't surface any desire for middle-income housing, and none of the trends seem to support that. I met somebody in town who, in order to qualify for affordable housing, had to sell her only asset, her car. So you have to be very well off to live here, or very your finance is pretty depleted to live here. What about the rest of us?
I'd like to start on that, if I may. Some of the survey information that Dr. Cohen relayed to you tonight came from a 2017 survey, and she described, and that survey is still on the town website, the survey report, so you can get a little more information about who responded and how many people responded. I will also tell you that we had 3 events in the fall where community members gathered, and this was called a World Cafe. It's a method of distilling group information. It's used by the National Park Service, a lot of corporations. We did 3 of them here, and affordable housing, and I don't mean affordable housing only subsidized, housing that's affordable came up over and over again, and we're going to be providing a little more summary of the output of those 3 World Cafes. So it was very loudly and clearly expressed at those 3 events, even though it may not have appeared in as strongly as it did in the World Cafes as it.
When affordable housing showed up on any of this presentation, it meant subsidized affordable housing, did it not? Oh, so you're using the larger meaning of affordable housing. The ability to afford. We need to have some distinction, I think, then, because in this town, when one speaks of affordable housing, it tends to be subsidized. So I'd encourage you to find a different way to talk about that.
That's a point well taken, that I should take responsibility for making sure we do that in these events going forward, because it's little a affordable housing sometimes, and then capital A, capital H, which is subsidized. So thank you, that's a good point.
One of the things we often hear is that Lexington is an anomaly in the demographic projections for Massachusetts and nationally, and especially in terms of school-age children and those kinds of things. I know we had the sort of regional information earlier, and now we have the trends in Lexington. Can you speak a little bit to how, and you spoke, Dr. Cohen, a little bit about how within Middlesex County, how Lexington stood in terms of wealth and everything else. I was wondering if you could speak, and I've forgotten your last name, I'm sorry, it's Dr. Kavanaugh, a little more about how Lexington compares to Middlesex County in terms of school-age children. Or I mean, I'm sure that data exists, because I know the regional board does it. I just was curious.
I'm not familiar with it in detail. What I do know is I used to be a former resident of Waltham and was very involved with those things. And what always struck me about my experience there as a resident, and that was very recent, they also happened to be having a conversation about a new high school and grappling with growth. So I was curious about, are they having extreme growth? They have been experiencing growth, but it is nowhere near as extreme as what has been experienced in Lexington just over the border. I would say in terms of projection, what happens with all these projections, regardless of time period or location, is when the trend is very volatile, when there is a dramatic change in the pattern. So say sometimes what we see on some of these enrollment graphs, depending on the scale, is you can very clearly see where the recession was. Because immediately following the recession, you see this dramatic drop. Some years out, the trend starts to grow. When we look at housing sales data about that time, that's when housing sales were picking up. And that time period where enrollment started increasing represents the beginning of financial recovery. I do have a general sense that Lexington was less impacted by that than some of the other neighboring communities. But the takeaway and sort of, again, the caution is if any of us could have predicted the recession, we would have known that would have happened to enrollment. But the enrollment wouldn't have been our biggest concern, of course.
To just put a little postscript on that. I have a map that was generated by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and it's a map of school enrollment declines in the Commonwealth, and it's all of the communities except 12, and we're one of them, for whatever that's worth.
When I was going to the meetings about the redistricting, there was a lot of people that were very unhappy with it. But didn't we still continue to realize that all this redistricting still won't take care of the problem of the increased enrollment? So we really need to do more middle school, more the whole 9 yards. I mean, that's what I really got from the picture of those redistricting. It was like that was a, what is it called, a Mary path or whatever. I mean, so it still seems there's a huge problem of not having enough space for the kids that are already in our school system. Am I right?
I mean, there's been a number of things. I just happened to come from a redistricting meeting. We're doing it again. But the theme underlying that, and it was all on purpose, was that we've tried multiple strategies for the last several years to combat it. And what was interesting was when I compiled the list of building projects that have taken place in the very short 5 years that I've been here, it's been quite a bit. So I'll get the years all wrong, but the running list is we replaced the Estabrook School, and when we did the replacement, we enlarged that school, adding more sections to that. We did modular additions to Bridge, Bowman, Fisk. We've expanded with brick and mortar at both our middle schools. We are about to finish in the next 2 years a standalone facility for the Lexington Children's Place. What happens with that is that allows us to move the Lexington Children's Place from the Harrington School, creating additional classroom space there. It also allows us to remove the parts of the Lexington Children's Place that resides currently in the central office out of the central office, which in turn allows us to move IT to the central office, creating not a ton, but a little bit more space at the high school. And then, of course, there's the much larger new Hastings facility that will be completed mid-year next year. So we've done quite a bit in terms of creating new space. And that does actually put us in a good position to the gentleman's earlier point about enrollment projections. Some of the projections, I would say 5 or so years ago, were predicting some higher numbers that we have not actualized. We still continue to grow, but we didn't quite hit those high numbers. So we're in a better position than we thought we'd be.
Well, that's good, because I remember being told that the Harrington was built and it was too small by the time it was built. And I'm hoping, because all schools have actually, Estabrook included, been too small for the amount of people that are coming in. And I know we even talked about the Hastings was going to be too small.
Other questions? Is there anything you heard tonight that really surprised you? If so, can I just see a show of hands? Any real surprises? Okay. Is there anything that you thought was missing? Any real obvious omission? Like, boy, I really thought I was going to hear about X. Show of hands, if so? Do you mind if I ask you? Not to put you on the spot, if you don't want to.
One of my questions was going to be that there was nothing about the total population in the town and how that's changed. It was just in the schools. But from my understanding, the population has not changed much at all over 20 years. It's been 32,000. But we really haven't seen a growth in population, overall population.
That's more or less true. And the staff has developed a set of charts and tables, and that material we're going to have on the website with some very basic, that exact kind of information about our demographic trends and changes. So we will have more of that kind of information. Is there any data source that you...
Carol? Can I just speak to the woman's question? The first slide that we had up talked about population change and projections about population. And you are right that the population in Lexington has not changed dramatically in a long time. And yet, if you go back 10 years ago, they were suggesting that the population in Lexington would be significantly larger than it is today. An illustration of just how bad predictions can be, or how inaccurate predictions can be. But it has remained relatively stable, and as I think I had said, in the years 2017 to 18, I think it was, our population actually declined just a small amount, but it declined. But it's been around the same number for a while.
Is there anyone who didn't get a chance to ask a question or make a comment who would like to do that? I can see it in your eyes.
Hi. I'm a parent that has children, 2 children right now in Hastings. And I know that the new Hastings is coming along. Yeah, it is. So my concern is what I'm hearing about possible redistricting. I know we went through 2016, and we have another one that I read is going to be far-reaching. And my concerns are that, I have a 3rd grader right now. When she finally gets into the new Hastings, it'll be the end of the 4th grade. And my concern is that, if she's redistricted that year, she's going to have to be sent to another school, possibly Estabrook, for her 5th grade years. Does that make sense? Is that something that you can even just talk about in terms of redistricting, or just give us an idea?
I would say those kind of details are very much on the forefront. We have only just started that process, so I cannot give any more definitive answer than that. But I would say those kind of very human details are very important to us.
When is the redistricting meeting? Is there one? Is it in the near future, or the dates haven't come out yet?
So we have 2 sort of groups working in parallel, a parent advisory group who's acting as sort of a standing focus group, a sounding board. We will be meeting with them throughout the spring and into the summer. We also have a working group who will be working away the sort of very public accessible things. We'll have information meetings around May. We have not picked dates yet. And then public hearings will occur sometime in September. I do certainly, if you can, the Master Planning Committee website is an example of how we intend to keep communicating about the redistricting. And if you are not familiar with my reports, I love producing reports. I love producing very detailed reports, and I cannot wait to give them to you.
Can I ask you one more question? I currently live on Reed Street as well. So is the buffer zone will be changing?
Buffer zone was a word that entered our lexicon that we just can't get out. We've never had buffer zones. They were sort of floated like a lead balloon here, so I don't anticipate they will come formally back on the table. But certainly, we can talk more very specifically immediately after this. I am also very much available, phone calls, emails, anytime.
All right, I want to thank Dr. Kavanaugh and Dr. Cohen very much, and I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. Good night.
Will your slides be available? I have no idea. That's a good question. Can they be?
If Dr. Cohen and Dr. Kavanaugh are willing to share them, yes.
Will you ask it?
Yes.
I would say, even if we didn't have the capacity, we're going to enrollment, and we need new high school, and is the town going to appetite for those things? The population size, right? Yeah. If you don't have the crisis.
numbers at you, and you think, what am I supposed to do with that? So, thank you, I appreciate that. Yeah, I always feel that I need to show people graphs and numbers so they can sort of process that and get into talk about it. So thank you for coming. Hi, how are you? Good, how are you? Oh, it's my pleasure. I love doing this stuff. I'm a little like Maureen. I'm a kind of data freak, and I love that stuff. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Oh. Yeah, so part of the reason I gave the 2000 to 2017 charts was that I wanted you to see that it looked like things were happening, and to some degree they were, and to some degree they weren't. and then you look at that and you think, okay, so is that predictive? So if I look at, for example, the one on ethnicity where you saw clear pattern changes, does that mean that in 2022, when whites are down to 63.5%, by 2035 they'll be down at 50%? No, not necessarily. Will the Asian population become 50%? Not necessarily. Who knows? I mean, I don't think anyone in the year 2000 would have predicted the giant increase in the Asian population that we saw. But maybe we've hit a leveling off point. Maybe it's just the start of an upward trend. Right. Yes, they did. But still, so mostly what you can see when you look at where we've been is where we've been. But where we've been isn't necessarily a good predictor of where we're going. And that's the problem. And so people do, as Maureen was saying with the methods that they use to make school projections, they've got two very different methods. They get two very different predictions. It's like when you watch the weather forecasts and where the snow line's going to be. Who knows? It's a European model, U.S. model. And as I was saying, there are so many variables, some of which we're aware of, but even the ones we're aware of, we don't know what they're actually going to do. And then there's the whole, and then it may not do it. And then there are all those variables we know nothing about, and we haven't even thought to consider, and one of those may be the key factor. It's all probabilities, and that's uncomfortable for people. People don't like probabilities; they like certainties. Exactly. There's a famous line from a very famous physicist, Richard Feynman, who said that all things are possible. Some are just more probable than others. And I love that line because I think, well, that's perfect. It was good to see you. Thanks for coming by. Sure. Yes. We'll pull that average way up, yes. I thought I did. Yes, so part of the slide that I had on income shows you the distribution of income in town by percent. No, on the bar charts. That had the distribution of income going from low income to, yeah. And then at the bottom I had, I don't remember which slide,